last time we were together, we looked at the ways in which America, especially in its late 19th, early 20th century context, was encouraging or pushing the church because of America's booming economy. That as America became a powerful, rich nation, that Americans wanted to revel and really celebrate that sense of power and influence. And that enthusiasm started making its way then into the life and thought of the American church. And so it changed things like ecclesiology, the way in which even a local congregation functioned in the larger sense of perhaps a denomination, that the emphasis shifted more to the big, powerful bureaucracy because Americans were taken with big, powerful institutions. And increasingly, the local congregation became almost an employee or a servant of the larger bureaucracy. That new sense of power also changed the way American religion even thought about financing itself, the way in which it mimicked the successful patterns of American industry, that you didn't leave financing open to fluctuation, that you would create endowments, that you would have a very strong financial base, reserved even for your work. And that increasingly American Christians thought about marketing the gospel in the same way that they were successfully marketing other consumer products. Sell it like soap, sell the gospel like soap, one individual had remarked. And so not only do you have a change in ecclesiology, a change in the way churches think about finances, but changes also in the way that ministers function within the life of the church. Now the minister, he wasn't one of the people. He had to somehow or another sort of be a slice above. He had to dress for success. He had to move in the right circles. He had to project the right image. He had to deliver the right kind of lesson. In the late 19th, early 20th century, increasingly Americans didn't want challenging, what we might call now, hellfire and brimstone sermons. Now they wanted an affirming, almost therapeutic message, one that left you feeling comfortable about who you were when you left the church. And increasingly, the minister was encouraged to target his message to the trendsetters of the day, to connect, to convert the rich and the powerful, and that if you got those leaders in society on your side, well, then the masses would take care of themselves. So you didn't have to worry about the little people so much. Get the right person, and the masses will follow. Consequently, because business provided the model of success in American culture, increasingly the American church started looking and sounding like American business. They were using what worked elsewhere for now successful models for church growth. Well, not everyone was comfortable with that, as you can imagine. The way the American church baptized, if you will, consumer capitalism. Some people started raising some nasty questions. As they looked around at American success, they realized that it wasn't always even. That in fact, close to the end of the 19th century, about half of the American population lived in poverty. So you had incredible wealth in the hands of some, but devastating poverty afflicting lots of Americans. Should the church say something about that? Could the church, for example, accept the gifts of an individual like Andrew Carnegie, who made for himself $500,000 a week while he paid his worker $452 a year? Could they take his money? Could they take his millions for their work as the church? Or should they say, no, Mr. Carnegie, maybe you should give a living wage to your worker first before you start giving it to the church? Could the church tolerate some of its own preachers, like the Henry Ward Beechers, who frequently would dismiss the claims of the average worker? In 1877, for example, railroad workers who were making $1.75 a day went out on a wildcat strike when the owners announced a 40% cut in wages. Henry Ward Beecher's response to that was, water's free, bread's pretty cheap. The individual who cannot live on bread and water doesn't deserve to live. Wow. Should preachers talk like that? They started wondering, is anybody asking, everybody's embracing our success, but should we be asking at what cost comes this success? Well, at the beginning of this series, a few weeks back, we looked briefly at Christ's charge for disciples to be leaven in the society. And as the Apostle Paul reminded the Corinthians, really, we don't have a choice in being leaven. We are going to be leaven. It's either going to be good leaven or bad leaven, and the choice is ours. And it depends in many ways on our theological orientation as to whether we're going to be good leaven in society or unfortunate leaven. And as the apostles warned in Romans chapter 12, 1 Peter chapter 1, conformity to the culture can be the wrong kind of leaven. So tonight what I want to do is point out some individuals who were pushing not this leaven of accepting culture, but what I'm calling the leaven of reform. The people who wanted to push and ask the questions, to say, wait a second, should the church go down this path with society? And the first individual I want to call your attention to is a guy named Washington Gladden. He was one of these prophetic individuals who was upset not only with the way American business and American culture was going, but the way in which American religion accepted that so uncritically, he said. He said, why are we not reading the Hebrew prophets again more critically? Because they told us, they reminded American Christians that God called for justice and mercy before God asked for pleasing sanctuaries and fine accoutrements. He said, do we need to read again Isaiah, the 58th chapter, verses 6 and 7? What does God really want from his disciples? God wants you to share with the hungry, to reach out to the oppressed and the marginalized. Washington Gladden argued that to be a Christian meant the acceptance of the golden rule. There's the essence of the Christian ethic, he said. The ruling axiom of ethical conduct is the command that a man shall love his neighbor as himself. And he said, is that what's really taking place in the American church at this time? And Washington Gladden was a little confused. He couldn't understand why, with the New Testament around for some 1,800 years, the Christians still couldn't grasp the power of agape. That self-sacrificial love, the kind of love that puts somebody else's interests before your own. And why Christians, not only in America, but really throughout its history, why we tend to push in every individual for his or her own self. He said, think about the way in which we let culture define what is normative. Oh, we think, he said, we think that this kind of dog-eat-dog, rugged individualism, everybody look out for number one, that's natural law. And that because it is natural, somehow or another, it has to become normative. But he said, think about it. We as Christians have already committed our lives to a radically different normative standard. And that standard is the teachings of Jesus Christ, the example of Jesus Christ. So we don't look out for what's in our best interest, but we embrace the ethic of Jesus, which is that self-sacrificial love, no matter what the cost. So he said, please, don't let society dictate to you what is normative. Always look to Christ for what is normative, and then take that and put it into action wherever you are. And as he looked around his society and he saw what he believed to be these profound inequalities, he asked, why are those there? And increasingly, he said, it comes back to the sin of selfishness. That we have these systemic social sins because we have misoriented the normative standards. Whether the issue is contention, strife, division, monopolies, poverty, militarism, he went on. He said the root cause is the inability to take the teaching of Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount and make that our exclusive normative standard. Even though it threatened his job at times, he would try to take that and live that out. He worked for a pretty well-to-do congregation in Columbus, Ohio. In Columbus, the Anchor Hocking Glass Factory had one of these late 19th century strikes that was very violent, and it was dividing the community. And he said, it's not the responsibility of anyone to take a side, but to really get in the middle and to mediate, to be the leaven of reconciliation in this moment, in this place. And so that's what he tried to do. And as he was wrestling with how to be that kind of person, to live that way, he penned what becomes for him an anthem of social reform. We still sing it. Washington Gladden wrote, "O Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free." You know the song. It's a way of saying we're going to challenge culture. And more than that, we're going to try to be Christ in this place at this time for these people. And because he pushed this and taught this, he inspired other people. One of his fellow Congregationalist ministers lived out in Topeka, Kansas. His name was Charles Sheldon. Charles Sheldon wondered what would in fact happen if people took literally the Sermon on the Mount, the ethic of Jesus, and intentionally put that into their life. So he tried to play this out a little bit. On Sunday evenings, he decided he would give a series of sermons based on the fictional character Henry Maxwell. Now, Henry Maxwell was a preacher, this fictional character, of pretty modest abilities. Nonetheless, Henry Maxwell was going to ask his congregation to live by this question: what would Jesus do? Pretty popular question here in the last decade or so, but it's an age-old question. And he penned this, Charles Sheldon did, in the story of the fictional Henry Maxwell, in the book In His Steps, or What Would Jesus Do? Let me read you a couple lines from this. This is the fictional character Henry Maxwell speaking. Would it not be true, think you, that if every Christian in America did as Jesus would do, that society itself, the business world, yes, the very political system under which our commercial and government activity is carried on, would be so changed that human suffering would be reduced to a minimum? What would be the result if in this city every church member should begin to do as Jesus would do? What would Jesus do in the matter of wealth? What principle would regulate his use of money? What would Jesus do about the great army of unemployed and desperate who tramp the streets and curse the church, or who are indifferent to it, lost in the bitter struggle for bread that tastes bitter when it is earned on account of the desperate conflict to get it? Would he go his way in compassionate ease and comfort? Would he say it was none of his business? What would Jesus do in the center of civilization that hurries so fast after money that the very girls employed in great business houses are not paid enough to keep their soul and body together without fearful temptations? Would Jesus, if he were here today as a part of our age and commercial industry, feel nothing, do nothing, say nothing in the face of these facts which every businessman knows? Those are powerful questions and hit home. And he created, first Washington Gladden, then Charles Sheldon, other people who, to sort of appropriate that phrase, followed in their steps, these modern prophets, these people who asked these questions about what Christians ought to be doing. In their wake came a young man from New York. His name was Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch was a little upset at what he saw the kind of either-or choice that American religion was offering at the moment. That either the church just sort of accepted everything cultural and did as culture dictated, or the church ran away from it and said, well, the world is none of our concern, we're really focused on the life hereafter. And Walter Rauschenbusch said, the problems are here, the suffering is now. I can't accept it or I can't ignore it. He graduated from Rochester Theological Seminary in 1886 and had really hoped that he would get a call to India, that he would be a missionary to India. But as the case sometimes is with life, things don't play out just quite as planned. And instead, he wound up getting a call to a German Baptist church in a section of New York City that was so run down and terrifying, it was nicknamed Hell's Kitchen because of the incredible poverty. And for the next 11 years, Walter Rauschenbusch saw with his own eyes what poverty did to people, how unemployment created despair, insecurity, what malnutrition did for the long haul to children, and how disease could kill and disrupt families. He saw how increasingly in these urbanized settings, apartment rooms were divided up with 3 families living in one room. You sort of divvy up a corner and maybe kind of put a curtain up, and that was your living space. And there were no windows in this apartment, and there was no indoor plumbing in this apartment. And you were there to live until you managed to escape somehow. Should Christians say something about this? Should Christians, as Christians, say something about this? And then he found out, not just that these conditions were overwhelming, he found out that there was, in New York City at the time, a single large slumlord that controlled $16 million worth of these tenement buildings. These buildings without ventilation, without windows, without indoor plumbing. He helped push the city government of New York for at least some zoning laws, some building laws that said we're going to put a ventilation shaft in and at least 1 bathroom per floor. Not much, but it's better than having 1 pump out in the courtyard that everyone has to use and leaving cesspools festering just outside the building with raw waste. The slumlord fought that for 3 years. Now, what's bad about the story is not just the conditions, but in fact who that slumlord was. That large slumlord that owned $16 million of these tenement buildings was Trinity Church, Wall Street. It was a church that was doing this. And they were making about $350,000 a year profit off of their tenement buildings. And with that money, they had created one of those beautiful church buildings. And they paid thousands of dollars for their music and their drama. And their preacher made 500 times higher than the national average. And he was saying, can we as Christians let the church do that without saying something? The root cause, Washington Gladden said, of all this was selfishness. He said, too often Christians think Christianity is about them. And he challenged people to say, Christianity isn't about me. If I'm following Christ, I take that teaching of Philippians 2, where Christ divests himself of all that he is due, and he takes on the form of a servant and empties himself, even to abject humiliation. So Christianity isn't about dying and going to heaven, ultimately, because that's where you'll get what you've always wanted and you won't have to worry about how you're going to pay for it. That really what Christ calls us to is what Christ himself modeled. Self-annihilation, self-abnegation, an extinguishing of your wants and preferences for the betterment of other people. You take up your cross and you follow Christ and live for others. So he was suggesting all those social problems that we saw came from the sin of selfishness. Sometimes economic, sometimes political, sometimes religious selfishness, as people were pursuing what they wanted out of the situation. And he called, as did Washington Gladden, to this kind of agape love that would be self-sacrificial. He stayed in Hell's Kitchen for about 11 years. Eventually, he went back to Rochester Theological Seminary, where he got a chance to teach. And there he wrote 3 books, Christianizing the Social Order, Christianity in the Social Crisis, and a theology for the social gospel that inspired a series of 20th century American prophets. Very quickly, let me come to an individual inspired by Walter Rauschenbusch, and you know this person. Martin Luther King Jr. We celebrate his life. We frequently forget that he wasn't primarily a civil rights leader, he was a minister, and that his entire agenda was influenced by his perception and understanding of Jesus Christ. Now he too, like some others, born into a fairly comfortable family, had pretty good education, went to Morehouse College, Crozer Theological Seminary, PhD from Boston University. It was at Crozer that he read Walter Rauschenbusch, and he said, having read Christianity in the Social Crisis, that book left an indelible imprint on my thinking. That the gospel deals with the whole person, not just the spirit that lives on after life, but the body that lives now as well. And he said any religion that isn't concerned about the souls of people and is not concerned about the slums that condemn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is a spiritually morbid religion awaiting burial. And he said, like so many other of these prophets, that we, the church, must let loose that spiritually aggressive power of agape love. And what's so unique about agape that you can't find anywhere else, that the church is the only place with this message, is that it creates the beloved community. A community that never seeks to dominate or win at somebody else's expense. And that its focus is never on its need, but on the needs of the other. And that agape love can release and relieve the internal violence of the spirit, the kind of hatred that comes from injustice. That with agape you can let that go. It's not just a cover for deep-seated loathing, but truly is a way of loving the other person. Because it doesn't attack people. It never attacks a person. It might attack or challenge an injustice. Because there is, he said, and here's the genius of Christianity, redemptive suffering. That just as we are redeemed by Christ's suffering, the world can continually be redeemed by the suffering of the church. And that we don't avoid that, we embrace that with a smile on our face and a song in our heart, in imitation of Christ, the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And so he suggested in his classic 1963 piece, Letter from a Birmingham City Jail, that we're going to be a little extreme. But think about all the extreme examples of love throughout Scripture. That really is what we are called. We are going to be against the norm of society, against the culture. But that's all right. Because if we aren't, where else can culture get this message, get this model of agape love. Well, to wrap up the series, I'm not sure whether it's fair how I've summarized American religious history. I've sort of grouped people on one side or the other, the accommodationist side, the Whitfields, the Finneys, the Conwells, etc., or the resistance reform side, the Puritans, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, or modern prophets like Washington Gladden, Charles Sheldon, Walter Rauschenbusch, and others. But to wrap up, I'd like to return back to that metaphor and parable of leaven in Matthew's Gospel, because it's preceded by two other parables, the sower and the mustard seed. And if there's a theme running through these three parables, it is the sovereignty of God. It's the sovereignty of God. Certainly we are called to be God's agents in society. And so we rightly wonder how we ought to live out that call, what's responsible discipleship. But we have to remember, above all, that the real power of transformation, whether it's in our lives or in the life of society, is God's power, not ours. So as we look through history, we're not looking to solve a riddle or solve a puzzle. That if we get it figured out, if we get the right model figured out, that somehow or another we will live happily ever after as God's agents. God's power is a bit more mysterious than that, isn't it? It's frequently beyond our comprehension. So as we try to learn the important lessons from the history of Christianity, perhaps the first one is humility. Humility before the sovereignty of God. Thank you.